All right, so let's kick off this panel. It's used to be I used to say this was the welcome to the late night show like Jay Leno does and used to do in America, and others have continued, but maybe we'll not just be the late night show, maybe we'll try to turn this into a little hard talk and see where we are on certain issues. The obvious the title of the panel is EU Partnerships, a new EU, new partnerships. Things are changing in the world, and I think there's plenty of room for discussion and various scenarios of where the EU is going to evolve. And of course, special relationship with the United States also brings to the forefront the relationship of the United States to Europe and its other relationships in the world, and then of course the European relationships to other economic partnerships. So before I start, I'd like to read a passage, and it goes like this. The power to become habituated to his surroundings is a marked characteristic of mankind. Very few of us realize with conviction the intensely unusual, unstable, complicated, unreliable, temporary nature of the organization by which Western Europe has lived for the last half-century. We assume some of the most peculiar and temporary of our late advantages as natural, permanent, and to be depended on, and we lay our plans accordingly. On this sandy and false foundation, we scheme for social improvement and dress our political platforms, pursue our animosities and particular ambitions, and feel ourselves with enough margin in hand to foster, not assuage, civil conflict in the European family. Now, this passage was written in 1919 by John Maynard Keynes as a leading passage in his book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, which I'm sure most of you have heard of, and in which he had resigned to Lloyd George over the punishment of Germany and the reparations and things of that nature. But it could have been written today. If you think about what I read, it could have been written today concerning the sort of assumption that things are going to be okay, and that we can continue to feud and fight and things will take care of themselves. And now I think we're coming to a point in time where this is not something that we can assume for sure. And he also wrote there are other passages in this book which are enlightening. I don't want to go into it. He also gave a blueprint of how Europe should be organized, and in fact, the European Union resembles to a great extent what he wrote back in 1919, 1920. He talks about the leaders of Europe, and he says the future life of Europe was not their concern. The means of livelihood were not their anxiety. Their preoccupations, good and bad alike, related to frontiers and nationalities, to the balance of power, to imperial aggrandizements, to the future enfeeblement of a strong and dangerous enemy, to revenge, and to the shifting by the victors of their unbearable financial burdens on the shoulders of the defeated. And finally, he said, and this is a very short passage, it is an extraordinary fact that the fundamental economic problems of a Europe starving and disintegrating before their eyes was the one question in which it was impossible to arouse the interest of the four. When he talks about the four, he talks about obviously Clemenceau, Lloyd George, Woodrow Wilson, and the Italians that were present there. So this brings us to the questions of where is Europe right now, what are its weaknesses, how does it plan to overcome them, and has it done enough? And I will ask this question, obviously just a few words on this, and then I will ask obviously the ambassador of the European Union, the highest common denominator of the European Union, as I like to call his position. There's been, since 2008, I would say, I would put it this way, 2004 was the high point of Europe. There was the big bang, the big integration. And then, as of 2008, then came the Greek crisis, the Eurozone crisis, which is not resolved to this day, with various kinds of feuding within the European family of how this should be done, with talks of kicking Greeks out, with, at that point, the support of the United States of keeping the Eurozone together geopolitically and telling basically the German Chancellor and Schäuble, the finance minister, that should stay in. Then we had the migration crisis afterwards that led to certain developments on the internal political scenes of Europe that was probably mishandled. And finally, we had the Ukraine crisis, where Europe somehow seems to have failed in its leadership to do that. On top of that, it has not been able to secure borders, formulate a common policy, and has led to the alienation of the population in terms of looking for different populist solutions to its problems, including obviously the rise of some very, very extreme people. And finally, we get up to Brexit, and then obviously Europe is going to be something different as of this year. And this year is supposedly a year of decision. So, Ambassador Fabrizi, can you comment on some of these things, and how do you see the European leaders facing some of these things, given that there's also a variety of very different views on how things should be done?
Well, thank you, and good evening to everybody. And let me express my thanks for those who, before a party, still have the time and the stamina to listen to a panel. So we try to do our best to try to make it useful. So you made a number of, we say, points. Certainly, I mean, the Europe of the Keynes period is different than what the good Minor Keynes was thinking when he wrote the book. I mean, if you look at the Europe 75 years later, I mean, it's a stable, peaceful, economic, and a decent place where a number of people want to live, and a number of countries want also to be part of it. If you look at the last 10 years, where I think you concentrated your comments, so Eurozone, migration, Ukraine, I like to say there is those are not homegrown crises. We have imported all of this. Lehman Brothers started in Wall Street, didn't start in us. Migration didn't start here, started in Africa and Middle East. We didn't invade the Ukraine, somebody else did. But this just to say there is not to an excuse, but also to see where the threat has been coming to us. Where is our responsibility lies is that how we have faced this crisis. And certainly this has reflected the level of maturity of our project. Certainly for 60 years we have been very, very busy in building our own internal system. So the single market, the Schengen system was basically our main and foremost occupation was to build the European Union we have about. And we had not full toolbox for resisting to external shock. Certainly when Lehman Brothers came, we've gone through quite a painful exercise. It lasted a few years. But as far as today, we are in a much better position. So the economy, this is in a forum of economists. Europe is in the 22nd quarter of uninterrupted and consecutive growth. We've added 7.9 million new jobs in the past 5 years. The unemployment is at its lowest level since 2008. So, everything is good? No, certainly we have a number of issues there, but I wouldn't make the picture in which we are in crisis. We are in a union, we have its own challenges, and we are trying to respond. So on economy, I think we made a very good response. On migration, again, we had an internal system where it was based on the trade-off between Dublin and Schengen system. You bring some in, check the borders, and you go freely through this. Now, of course, the system was not prepared to another asymmetrical shock, was an efflux on millions of migrants at the same time. But if you look at 5 years later on, migration has remained a big political issue, but on the ground, the number of people that was entering illegally the EU dropped, the Balkan route is almost closed, Central Mediterranean route is almost closed as well, closed in relative term. On Ukraine, we made from day one position clear. we don't recognize illegal annexation, and we take our own position from there. So if your question is how Europe is doing, Europe is facing, as any other player in the moment, the shift that we see in economy, in society, means migration, in innovation. But we are sticking together, and I think after a number of years, we have a much better toolbox to match this challenge. And I think also the reality proved that no one left the Eurozone, so everybody was thinking of a domino effect after Greece. Greece didn't leave the Eurozone. Is growing again. After the Brexit referendum, a number of people were projecting a number of other referendums. No one is making referendum again, or referendum thinking to leave the country, or to leave the EU. So just to say that our position is much stronger than before. And maybe last point, we have, you represent correctly a word which is a shifting and is a recognition we also made when we wrote our strategy in 2016. We said the world is much more complex, is much more connected, is much more contested. There's a number of players around who play also by different set of rules. We continue to play by the set of rules that we have, which is transforming competition in cooperation, multilateralism, and basically building a European Union which is a global player.
Well, yeah, well, I'll come back to a few comments on that. For example, in the Eurozone, it's still a question mark, and the way that Greece was handled is a matter of controversy. They lost 25% of their GDP, and a lot of people have left, and this has also involved some of the migration from the countries that are within Europe that have left. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, a couple of years ago, what I read was that 26 million people have left Eastern Europe and moved to Europe, and a lot of these are the countries from transition and countries that have joined the EU later. And also concerning the Eurozone, if I remember correctly, the Italian coalition that came to power was promising a referendum on leaving the euro. And that's sure.
Right. No, on the internal migration of the EU is part of, I think certainly my colleague and Joanna can certainly give you a little bit more on this. The question is not the movement. The question is because EU is based on the 4 liberties. You can move around, you can do business around, you can do education around, and you can invest it around. The question is also if the people circulate, goes and come back, and also if these economies are growing. The country in the Central and East European Europe has grown, which I think mostly because of the European accession. On the EU referendum, I think, I don't see if there's any other representative, but it's not on the platform of the government to take any referendum on the belonging on the Eurozone. I think they made it clear before the election, after, and in any occasion. This is an important point to make.
Okay, thanks. Ambassador Popa, your country, Romania, has been growing significantly economically after its joining the European Union, and you're now having the presidency of the European Union. Now, this comes at a particularly difficult time for Europe itself because everybody's kind of be looking at the election. But in a few words, can you tell us what the agenda for the presidency? What are your priorities there for, I don't know, the Bulgarians had the Western Balkans. What are Romania's priorities for this presidency that you're heading now?
Thank you. Yes, I would like to apologize for my voice to begin with. It's a little shaky, so I would ask you to bear with me. Well, first of all, I would like to say that as a first-time presidency for us, this is a real special time because it also comes 30 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the communism. And we wouldn't have been here hadn't it been for that moment. On the other hand, yes, there is a background of challenges. You've mentioned them, Brexit, the European Parliament elections, the multi-annual financial framework, and these are issues that are not concerning our presidency for now, but there are issues that are stretching beyond that. Now, when we look at our priorities, we tried to design them according also to how we saw Europe and how we benefited mostly from EU integration in these past 12 years. And that is why we put cohesion as our motto, cohesion, a common European value, because cohesion is one of the European policies that Romania has benefited a lot from in reducing developmental gaps and especially regional development gaps. But we have designed our priorities according to 4 pillars, which of course are interdependent and determine one another. The first pillar is Europe of convergence, where we are looking at what I just said, reducing gaps, stimulating further connectivity. The second pillar refers to a safer Europe, and it looks at issues such as border security and migration. The third pillar is Europe as a stronger global actor, and here we are looking at enlargement and the Western Balkans and Europe's neighborhood in general. And the fourth pillar is the Europe of common values, where we're mostly considering issues related to equality, youth, anti-Semitism, and so on. So these are basically the 4 pillars that we're working along. We're also having a sustained trio program together with the Finnish and the Croatian presidencies that will follow after us, because many of the issues will not be able to address in those 6 months, having in view the
Right, sure, of course,
challenges
it's a
that
short
I
time.
have just outlined. So basically, there we are. It's ambitious, but it's also a way to bring Europe closer to the citizens, our citizens and European citizens in general.
Yeah, well, we'll come back to that when we talk about the reform of Europe, because a lot of Eastern European countries, when you mention values, are coming under attack in the sense that they're not really representative of European values. Romania in particular has come under hit for corruption. This is a big issue in the press in the West, et cetera, et cetera. But we'll come back to that when we discuss the potential reform of the European Union. Ambassador of Germany, welcome to this panel. This is your first time also. Welcome to Ambassador Popa. Germany has been seen as a sort of reluctant hegemon in Europe, big enough to enforce some rules, but not big enough or not willing enough to lead change. This has been, especially when the Eurozone crisis hit, this has been one of the views of that the mercantilist approach to trade, in the sense that it's running large surpluses for 7 or 8% of GDP in terms of balance of payments. This is not considered to be good by the economists anyway. This is not, in the last couple of months, this has gone down, but it's been there for years. The hard terms that the people in the South have seen on austerity in Greece and other countries, and that somehow Germany is in the middle and has not really had enough proposals for reform, or is sort of has been complacent. This is what you read in the press when you read the serious Western press about Germany, when they want to criticize and say Germany's role in the EU. And they're also pointing out to the fact that the mishandling of the migration crisis has, by Chancellor Merkel, has actually led to a situation where the Grand Coalition, meaning the 2 biggest parties, the CDU, SPD, SDP, are going to go below 50%. And this alternative for Germany was formed, and then this is sort of something that potentially will be a factor of instability in a country that was trying to stabilize as the largest economy of the rest of the European countries. Furthermore, there's talk about, we have sanctions on Russia, but we want the Nord Stream. The Nord Stream is going on. It doesn't matter. Other people are complaining, including the United States, over this. And somehow Germany seems, in this view that I've painted, Germany seems like a country that basically cares about itself and not too much about what the rest is doing. So maybe you can comment on a few of these points.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me to this late night panel. Unfortunately, Germany is not in the presidency. If so, I would have gotten the kind of maybe an easier question to answer. What about our priorities? So your questions were, I would say, much more difficult to answer, but then maybe not. I have to say I was a bit slightly irritated when you said Germany was complacent, reluctant to lead, a hegemon. I don't know, I would disagree. I think it's fair to say that indeed I still remember the times when this was quite a I wouldn't say popular, but an argument often made. Yeah? Germany kind of waiting for the mainstream positions to evolve and then taking a position. I think this is past. This was 10 years ago, maybe. But I have to say it is true. Yeah? I think this position, you can say it's a leadership position which Germany sometimes assumed in the last couple of years. Germany never sought for this position. It somehow came to us. I would say probably starting with the financial crisis, and it was a global financial crisis, like Sam Fabrizi said. It wasn't homemade, nor was the migration flows homemade. It's a global phenomenon, and Europe had to act. And I think then many simply looked at the German Chancellor, who has been around now for quite some time. And suddenly we were in this position. Yeah? I mean, my French colleague is not here, but I think it's not, I can say that there were a certain period of time where France dealt a lot with itself, so to say, and this famous Franco-German engine didn't really work as efficiently as it used to. But this is also in the past. Things have changed again. And I think, of course, you can say, well, look at Ukraine. It's still not solved, but at least the war, the hot conflict, the military conflict stopped. And I think also in this context, Germany played quite an essential role and is still playing this role. And I'm also not so sure. I know that I mean, you were probably referring to the proposals made by President Macron. Yeah, maybe the first reaction was typically kind of, I don't know, German, still first looking at it, first studying it. But as you know, we've just, President Macron and Chancellor Merkel just signed the Treaty of Aachen. And this is a renewal of the Élysée Treaty. And it also contains a number of ideas, proposals, and I think the idea is we are not kind of forcing anybody. The idea is to give an impulse. Yeah, what's contained in the treaty might serve as a model, as an impulse for increasing, furthering European integration, European cooperation, and European integration.
Fine. Well, look, it's my job to be irritating here. I have to tell you, all of you. That's one.
Of course. Yeah.
And two, concerning the past and all this, I've been reading this recently in The Economist, The Guardian. These things are not. These views of Germany are not just of the past. They're still there. And concerning the Macron-Merkel signing, it was just said, oh, this is an empty shell. This is just symbolic. This was the reaction of the British press, the American press, basically have said, came to nothing because Macron is really not going to be able to push the reform after the yellow vest and everything is going on there. Germany's reluctant, so nobody's going to move on anything, and we'll see what happens with the reform. But we'll come back to that. Okay, well, unless you want to respond quickly, yes.
Just to say, I mean, I think it's important to say, I think the European Union is really a success story. I think this is really, and one shouldn't be defeatist about it. So, I mean, this is just, and I'm really, and we are convinced, and we should not kind of, sometimes we just need some more time, yeah? But we'll come back to this later.
We'll come back to that, but the point is, no, everybody says the European Union, I don't think anybody denies that. It's a success story. What people are seeing now is like they're seeing Europe is getting torn by the seams, okay? It's falling apart, and not much is being done about it. And that's the sad part because Europe is a success story, so now we're going to be seeing maybe Europe as not a successful story, but as a failure in various ways. And I think this is part that drives this type of conversation recently concerning all these problems that have arisen. But we'll come back to that when we talk about the potential reform of Europe, and I'll throw you a scenario that I will see, and I'll see how you react to that. But Ambassador Scott, your country, Lehman Brothers, is getting blamed here for the world crisis and the recession, and personally, I wouldn't quite agree with that because the Eurozone had its own flaws, and all these banks were involved in the Greek bond buying, and these were German and French and whatever banks in English. But there's been, at the Munich conference, there was this evidential show that, you know, all of us have been used to this close partnership between the United States and Europe, and that somehow the agreements never came out in the big press, in the big titles, and in the big conferences, and in the direct talk among diplomats, among other things. Here specifically, I refer here to your colleague, American ambassador in Germany, who said those things that have really upset people over there over some of his comments. And in the Munich conference, basically it was said, Europe on the fundamental issue of the Iran deal that Europe helped broker and that the United States has seen as defunct, has also brought another big issue into the forefront, and that's with the European firms that have signed contracts, and now they can come under American sanctions because they're going to be dealing with Iran. And in fact, the Europeans have come up with a sort of a barter outside the dollars kind of system of paying this. They're coming up with this now for the first time after the Second World War in the international monetary system. The other story, obviously, is that there's been this looking at the Secretary of State's recent visit to the Eastern European countries as sort of playing on this, what Rumsfeld called the old and new Europe divide. This has been raised comments. And then especially Chancellor Merkel said that she was shocked the United States thought that making BMWs in South Carolina was a national threat to the United States. So all these things are kind of coming out now, and perhaps you can enlighten us on how do you see all these issues from the American perspective?
Well, actually, I see them quite calmly, and I'm not so worried about it. There are strains in the U.S.-European relationship, but there always have been. We've gone through periods of feast and famine, of crises and reconciliation. There was the Suez crisis. There was disagreements over Vietnam. There was the Pershing Missile crisis. But the fundamentals are what I think we should focus on. And when we focus on the fundamentals, the U.S.-EU relationship is the largest trade and investment partnership in the world. And it is also the most important strategic partnership for international engagement in the world. We're talking about a trade relationship which across the Atlantic every day more than $3 billion in trade and services cross. $3 billion per day. There are 15 million people either in the United States or inside the European Union who work for companies whose headquarters are on the other side of the Atlantic. This is a hugely important trading relationship. I'm very proud here in Serbia to say that there is $4 billion in American investment in Serbia. There is $3 trillion of American investment in the European Union. The European economy and the American economy are intertwined, and we share the same interests with regard to our welfare of our peoples and global threats that we face, whether it be the stability of the global financial system, whether it be combating terrorism, preventing weapons of mass destruction from proliferation, working on the threats caused by Russia and their invasion of Ukraine, facing up to a rising China. So I could go on with the various different issues which we have in common with the European Union. And while we have disagreements as well, we don't have a common foreign and security policy. We have disagreements, and there's no question that Donald Trump and his presidency have brought in new elements which are causing some strains, but also some changing thoughts, I think, in Europe that will, in the end, strengthen that partnership. We've already seen for years and years and years, as long as I have been a diplomat, in fact, I think we have been calling upon Europe to pay more for its own defense within NATO. The 2% target has existed ever since the Prague Initiative almost 20 years ago. And only now are we starting to see the European countries starting to take seriously those obligations. Similarly, the trade strains that Donald Trump has focused on in this administration are not new. Talk about tariff differentials, talk about standards being used as a protectionist measure, are things that we also heard in previous administrations. But I think his approach has been, in some sense, a bit shocking or off-putting by some, but it has also made people begin to look seriously at some of those issues, and I think that we'll see progress in them. But there are two things I think that are different that we should focus on. One is that Europe and the United States, as partners, have a lot of shared values and a lot of shared interests. But we remain competitors as well in the economic front. We have our own interests that we're pursuing, and that's reasonable. And there's another big issue which I think is a little bit of a philosophical difference. President Trump has made a significant priority on the question of national sovereignty. That was the entire theme of his address to the UN General Assembly this year, the importance of pursuing each country's national interests. The European Union is essentially an agreement among countries to share their sovereignty. And philosophically, I'm not sure that that's something that President Trump would see eye to eye with, except we can square that circle. We can get back to the basic point, and as the United States has said, and President Trump said, as is Secretary Pompeo, that countries can agree to multilateral approaches to problems. They can agree to share in that effort. And when I look around the world and I look at all of those issues that I talked about, who is Europe going to turn to as a partner? Or who is the United States going to turn to as a natural partner except for the European Union? A grouping which shares our basic values and which has the financial ability to engage globally in pursuit of the same basic goals and objectives that the United States has. Will we have disagreements? Sure. But on the vast majority of things, we agree, and we are pursuing that partnership. We have 25 different working groups on economic cooperation right now. We are pursuing that partnership, and we want to move it forward. So I'm not going to look at this as some big passion play or a reality show where we have to look for disagreements. We have so much in common. This partnership is so important for both the European Union and the United States. There's too much at stake.
Yeah, well, I agree with you on the trade issue. You pointed out very well, but then TTIP that was supposed to be negotiated, that went down the drain. And then the United States left the TPP in the Pacific. And the interesting development there was that in terms of, when we talk about, basically, you pointed out to the big dividing line of multilateralism versus unilateralism, and then the United States went out of a trade deal that was, the European one wasn't going to fly, but the one was already completed. And now what happened, I'm sure you realize, this, Japan has taken over the TPP and said we'll ratify it and we'll continue without the United States. And then Japan, as of February 1st, has a new economic partnership with Europe, then again brings 40% of GDP into the picture of a new type of economic alliance. So it seems to me the Europeans are still sticking to this multilateralist approach. The U.S. is sort of getting out of it as much as it can, wherever it can.
Can I follow up on that just for a
Sure,
second?
please.
I mean, in the end, the United States is a democratic country, and President Trump ran on a campaign which clearly stated that he did not think the Trans-Pacific Partnership was a good deal for America and that he would not go through with it. And he was elected president.
Yeah, well, it wasn't, you know, people don't get elected on these issues. People get elected on other issues, as you know. I mean, nobody gets elected on a single issue unless it's war or peace. But as you know, there was a long negotiation on that. The whole American administration put a lot of effort into putting it together, then went down the drain. But what I'm trying to say is that other Asian countries have decided to stick to it. And then as I said, you know, Japan has also started looking towards Europe and has been negotiating an economic partnership on a different basis. Let's move, since the American ambassador has the floor right now. What about the other big issues? What about this whole deal with Iran? What about China? What about the rise of China? There's a feeling that the U.S. now, it's not just the relationship to Europe, but it's also the relationship to China. I'm sure a lot of Chinese think that this is a new policy of containment of China, this trade war, that it's disrupting also, among other things, European trade. These trade wars are not good for trade, and I think some of the trade for Europe has gone down, if I read the statistics correctly, in the last couple of months, especially in Germany, among other places. And then also there's this confrontation with Russia, and then this sort of strained relationship with Iran and the nuclear deal. And somehow, you know, there's a general impression that all of a sudden the boat is being rocked a lot by the United States, in the sense that the United States has sort of created a certain, in multilateral institutions like the WTO, the trade war, this or that, some kind of instability that's becoming a sort of a factor of instability. So maybe you can elaborate on that a little bit, because a lot of this has been written about, a lot of this has been talked about, including in the American press, as you know. So maybe we can shed some light on these aspects of this shifting attitude towards China and free trade, to pushing Russia at the same time, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, that's a lot of different issues all packed into one big question.
Sure, I know. Well, you don't have to. We don't have all day, so and you don't have to answer all of them.
I think if I were to try to, you know, take a slightly higher vantage point and look down at the bigger picture, I think we are entering an era of great power competition, in which we see a rising China, we see a more assertive Russia, we see the European Union, which is still a key player, but also is pursuing its trade and economic interests, and the United States, which remains a major player on the global scene. And we're all seeking the advantage for our country. In the case of China, we were and remain an advocate of China's integration into the global trading system, based upon following the rules that everyone else is playing by. China's, you know, you talked about containment. I don't think that's a proper term at all, although I do think that there are concerns, not just by the United States, but by a number of the countries in Southeast Asia, about China's efforts to expand its territorial reach, to essentially seize the South China Sea as an inland sea, to stop international navigation through the South China Sea. And that's a principled stand. It's important for our security partnerships with countries in that region, and one that we will continue to resist. But what I think is the bigger issue with China is on trade policy. And here, the sense that the United States, and not just the United States, faces structural impediments to free trade with China, and that those issues need to be addressed in our trading relationship to go forward. I'm talking about the need for stronger intellectual property rights protection by China, the need to try to stop China from forcing companies to hand over their technology in order to do business in China, which then the Chinese copy, use, and eventually put the company out of business through both what we would call illegal trade practices, whether it be non-tariff barriers, higher tariffs, cyber theft of companies' intellectual property, market distorting, subsidies, dumping, a whole range of issues which we feel are allowing China to gain unfair advantage over others in the international trading system, and we believe that they need to be addressed. That's what Donald Trump has said very clearly directly to President Xi. We are working on a new trade agreement between the United States and China. We're hopeful that we will reach that agreement in the coming weeks. That's all part of the bigger picture of doing it, of working on our trade issues. It's the same sort of disputes that we have had for a long time with the European Union that we would like to see resolved. You know, the reality is that with the European Union, at least, our basic tariff levels are incredibly low on both sides. But there are a few exceptions to those rules, and there are a lot of non-tariff barriers, standardization barriers, which are preventing American products from being sold in the European Union, and perhaps vice versa. And we think they should be addressed. The President, together with Mr. Juncker, committed to zero tariffs. That's the goal. That's what we're shooting for. But I think it also has to deal with other issues. Yes, we have disagreements about Iran. But once again, the President ran on a campaign saying clearly that he intended to junk the agreement on Iran. And he has fulfilled what he promised the American public he would do in the elections. And we in the European Union are now going to have to work through the fallout of that process on how that relationship will move forward. But I think that we actually don't disagree on a lot of the things on Iran. We agree with the European Union that Iran's missile technology efforts are a danger. We agree that their nuclear program is a concern. We agree that their support for terrorist organizations around the globe is a concern. Those are all issues that have to be addressed, and most of them were not addressed in the Iran deal.
Yeah, well, the Europeans still want to stick to it, though. The Europeans still want to stick to it, and they think this is one of the jewels in their diplomacy and working this whole thing out for years. But anyway, let's all move to another subject. There's some scenarios that are being talked about now in the European Union, and one is, and you know, this is sort of coming up in the papers of the European Union that is put out of where it's going, and there's sort of certain scenarios that have been put out. One is the carrying on scenario. We'll just continue, muddle through. Things are going to be okay. We're a success. Things will work themselves out. That's, say, number one, a carry on, muddle through. The second scenario would be we'll have nothing, we'll retreat. We'll go have nothing but the single market. We'll forget everything else, okay? Then we'll go back to basics, back to where we once belonged, like the Beatles song says, okay? And then there's the third scenario that says, okay, some of us will do more, that we want to do more, and those that can do more will do more, and the others will be left out. And then the scenario is, okay, let's do fewer things but more efficiently. And then there's finally the sort of federalization, let's do more things together, okay? So these are sort of the scenarios that have been flown by the European Union. I'll give you my guess of what's going to happen. And it's not a very pleasant picture, but it's good to irritate people and discuss it, okay? And I have a feeling that this is going to go into the Europe of several speeds, that the Nordic countries, along with the Benelux countries, along with Germany and probably France, will say, okay, now we're going to be back to the inner core of the European Union. We'll do we are able to handle the Eurozone. Maybe we'll keep Spain in because they're showing some effort there, but we'll slowly ease out Italy and Greece out of the Eurozone, and we'll have a deeper integration there, and then we'll set up some rules about the other countries of Eastern Europe that, in our view, don't really belong to Europe as an idea. They belong to Europe geographically, but as Tony Judd, when he wrote the post-war, the big book, he said basically he has cast doubt on whether Eastern Europe could actually be part of Europe. And things that have evolved in Poland, things that have evolved in Hungary, the murder of the people in Czechoslovakia, the issue of corruption in Romania, other issues, they're forming this kind of line of thinking saying, look, these people are not really part of our club, so we'll make the periphery of Europe as part of a secondary type of citizenship. And then last but not least, when the Western Balkans comes, there'll be the third level of this periphery of the periphery, and we'll sort of slowly, this will evolve into this type of direction. So, so that's my dark view of how things are going to work out. But what is your thoughts on the scenario? How is Europe going to evolve, Ambassador Schiep?
Thank you very much. Well, I think we are not at the Foreign Ministry in Berlin, or the Chancellery for that matter. Of course, we are, we are not discussing the scenarios you mentioned. I mean, for us, we have the Lisbon Treaty, and this is the foundation on which we work. Now, we are not naive.
I'm sorry, these scenarios came out of the European Commission, you know. I didn't dream them up, you know. It was sort of paper, huh? Yeah, okay.
But let me, so I wouldn't be able to speculate. But I would say, yes, indeed, there are challenges, no doubt. And we had this discussion today in a different panel that internal reforms of the European Union, which are needed, and enlargement are not contradictory. For once, we have to, this was, again, I wouldn't be able to say this is where we will end up. For the time being, we have the Lisbon Treaty, and we are working for more integration, more European integration on the one hand, and enlargement on the other. This is what we do. This was mentioned also. The EU has definitely improve its ability to act, also in foreign policy. So this is one field where we have to improve. And there's, for example, one idea, because in foreign policy we still have the principle of unanimity, which often leads to the problem of the lowest common denominator. And this is a problem. So this is one track of possible reform, to decide, agree in which areas the European Union could decide with a majority vote to become more efficient. This is one track. There's an idea also, and this is I think also what something you refer to, that those countries, those member states of the European Union, if they want to, groups of EU member states go forward and integrate more and quicker than others. And I think this approach has been applied already in the context of the permanent structured military cooperation. So the idea would be some move forward and others, but it's going to remain open for everybody, for every EU member state, and those who would like to join later will join later. So this is also one approach.
What about when you all talk about common values and European values, what about the fact that Macron said, something about Kaczynski and then Orban, and these are not really people who are abiding by our values, and we should do something about this, and they're using our money and not being responsible. In the case of Orban, this has come out openly in the press in the European Commission. And then there was this back and forth between Salvini and the Italian government and Macron. So, things don't look that easy in the sense that we are going to just work out a few things. Eventually, I understand what you're saying is, if I understand correctly, is we'll keep these things on afloat, and then we'll see how slowly we will maybe make some changes, and maybe we'll allow certain people to go up on the upper deck, and some of them, if they can join, will join later. But it seems to me that what about the way of the toolkit for Europe to enforce values? on countries that, once they're in, there's not much that can be done about it. So in a way, it's, all this talk about stabilocracies is not something that was made up for the Western Balkans. It's made up for Orban and for some other people, and it's totally in the open. So how do you handle that?
Well, yes, it's true. We have our issues at the moment, and we are working on it, for sure. But I think it would be somehow, because I think you mentioned a little earlier that the EU, if I understood you correctly, the EU was falling apart. I think we do have our issues, and this is definitely one of them. This we do have to do our homework, and we are hopeful and optimistic. But it's not the end of the story. Yeah, we have our mechanisms. If they are not working efficiently enough, we have to look into this. But all in all, we are optimistic that we are going to overcome this situation. So I would just like to caution a little bit. Yeah, we have our issues. Yeah, but this should not lead to an overall general negative perception of what the European Union stands for.
Sure. Well, look, obviously, yeah, purposely I've dramatized a few things to point them out so we can discuss them, because if they're phrased too diplomatically, we'll never get into a more concrete situation. Ambassador Popa, how do you see the reform of the European Union? What's going to happen, and what is the Romanian view of all these scenarios that have been floating around, talked about? Are you afraid of this issue that, you know, countries of Eastern Europe are basically will be delegated into some kind of a periphery of the core of Europe?
No, we're definitely not afraid of anything. And I would also like to caution against sort of a catastrophic view of the future. Because on the one hand, if there are issues, I wouldn't call it a crisis, but if there are issues, they're not the first nor the last. And Europe has dealt with challenges before. It will deal with them in the future. And it's a process. Let us not forget that the fifth wave of enlargement has changed the structure of the EU fundamentally, and it takes time to digest that. So these are not things that can be sorted out overnight. As far as we are concerned, we think that the shared values and the compatible administrations inside the EU between the member states are the most important aspect, and that cooperation and multilateralism and talking things through are the way to do things. And so far, we have to do things through consensus, like Ambassador of Germany said, and if that is going to change in the future or not, that is also something that is going to be decided through discussions and agreements at the end of the day. It's not going to be imposed from anywhere else on the outside. Now, we strongly believe that economic and social convergence is the work that needs to be done, not creating more gaps, but reducing the ones that are existent. And so far, at least from our experience, we have benefited greatly, and we have reduced the gap between us and other EU core members in the past 12 years. In fact, we have had tremendous economic growth, increasing foreign direct investment. We have successfully reduced regional gaps inside our country. So mobility, because Ambassador Fabrizi mentioned that in the beginning, is the one policy of the EU that we have greatly benefited from, and I do not think we should look at it from the negative side, because today, 10 plus years after we joined the EU, we actually see a little bit a reversal of that process, people coming back and investing money that they have made abroad. So there are positive things that you can...
Good, I agree. But, you know, the mobility thing is what brought the British to Brexit, in a way, you know. So we don't want these immigrants to come to our country. We don't want the Polish plumber anymore. We want this and whatever. So there's two sides of this coin. Maybe it's benefiting you, but maybe some other people show more resistance to this kind of thing going on.
Well, I think mobility has benefited the UK. In fact, we hear a lot of regrets these days about what is going to happen if the Europeans.
Look, I might agree with you, but a lot of people in Britain don't. So that, I mean, that's what led to one of the things that led to the Brexit result. But okay, so basically you think that the scenario of Europe at various speeds is really not going to happen, or is it going to happen?
No, I would not comment on scenarios. I mean, at the academic level, of course.
Yeah, well, that's what, yeah, okay.
We can talk about a lot of things at the academic level, but when it comes to reality, I don't think that things are like that black and white scenario A, B, C, or D. I think that things are much more nuanced. And whether there may be times when certain aspects from these scenarios may take place, overall, things are bound by certain mechanisms that function inside the EU.
Okay, thank you. Professor, Ambassador Fabrizi, your floor.
Well, the scenario that Ivan is referring is the paper that President Juncker submitted
Yes.
ahead of Bratislava in 2016, just a little bit after the Brexit. So it was an important contribution by the Commission to steer a little bit the debate. Certainly, if we look where we are 2 years after, 3 years after, I would say there is a sort of, the EU has already gone through a combination of these 5 such scenarios. But if we stick to what the EU as such, the EU 27 agreed already in Bratislava in 2016, was so basically we realized, so we were shocked by the Brexit referendum, just to remind to our audience, in 23rd June 16. There was a number of question marks, what happened next? And certainly, the Commission made its own useful job to try to steer the debate. And when the leaders met in Bratislava, basically they agreed we have a difficult situation to handle. There's no panic, but where we need to work. And the idea was to work on external border, because the migration was a big issue, on internal security. Terrorism was a big issue at that days. External security, defense, and economic growth. So if you look, and after we had a similar declaration in Rome in 2017, because it was the 6 years of the Treaty of Rome, and we will have a meeting in Sibiu on 9th of May in Romania. So basically, these scenarios are translating in an union which is not launching in any constitutional debate, but is looking at where the weak point, where our weak point were: security, terrorism, economic growth, migration, and we are doing quite a good amount of work, I would say, to fix it. At the end of the day, right now we are 2 months before election. In election period, people get not only irritated but also animated. But at the end of the day, this European election will be important because people will realize that Europe matters. Europe matters, and this is why this election will be particularly important. And at the end, will be a political battle between those who believe that we are better off staying together and working together, and those, a minority, but quite vocal, they believe that bringing back to Europe where we were 6 years ago is a response for the future. So I still believe that the pro-EU forces are the majority in the people, it will be the majority in the parliament, and we will have a couple of months to wait to see what the result. And certainly, if I make a point, we didn't peak in 2004. I don't buy the idea that Europe were peaked in 2004 and after.
So far.
The world changed. Right. We are still in there, and I think we are stronger than before. We are maybe we have a different toolbox, where we have a new capacity to react.
Okay. Well, thank you. Now, if anybody wants to put in one sentence before, I would really like to offer the public, they've been good and sitting here at a late hour. And if any of you has one sentence or a very short sentence that wants to end this on some kind of a note, please use that now. Ambassador Scott, yes or no? Well, you don't have to.
Since you asked me, I will just say, I'm not going to pull out a crystal ball and say what these various different scenarios for the European Union will be. But the European Union has faced crises before, has faced challenges before, and every time it has emerged stronger and better. And this experiment of the European Union, which has brought decades of peace, stability, and prosperity to Europe, I consider to be one of the great experiments of mankind and one of the great stabilizing factors for the European continent. And I certainly hope that whatever the scenario, they will emerge stronger, more prosperous, and more stable out of this. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? Ambassador Sheep, I think, wants to say something.
Maybe I can just subscribe to what my American colleague just said. Maybe once again, a word of caution. I think this image of the European Union, I was in the UK for a certain while, and at a time when Brexit was still not, just came up, and but the EU had a very negative image for many years, and then in the end, the Prime Minister at the time said, well, in the end, it is a good idea, let's remain. And, well, you know what happened. Yeah. So I think it's important to be careful about the image we are conveying.
Okay. Anybody else?
Well, the EU is certainly not perfect, but so far, like democracy, it's the best form of union for nation states that exists.
So, quoting Churchill, the best form where you tried everything else. But I will say that I agree that thanks Kyle for the strong belief in the Euro-American partnership, which is a natural and indispensable one. Basically, my final comment would be on the European integration at different speed. I mean, is also already a matter of fact. The Eurozone is already, Schengen is another, PESCO is another. The point is that the question is those initiatives are open to everybody, and everybody realize that sooner or later they will be joining. And what the problem of the Brexit was, that basically the British pull out from any initiatives since the 90s, and they could not see the future there, and so the decision was what at the end the referendum brought about.
Okay, now I've irritated you enough, so I'm not going to do it again, but I will let people in the audience, if they want to ask a question, do so now. We have maybe, but please identify yourselves and pose the question, if there's anybody. Anybody? It's too late for a question. Nobody's. Huh? Okay, go ahead. Is there a microphone here or? Oh, we'll hear you. You have to stand up and.
All right. I'm Daniel. I'm interested in this context of the image of Europe. What are the suggestions, recommendations for our political class selling integration as a concept in the long run, because it's going to take us a while before we enter, if we enter, and to maintain the public opinion on sufficient level of support, which is important for reforms. How to sell Europe in the accession countries?
I think that there was a panel here that discussed this a lot this afternoon, wasn't it? There was a panel that discussed practically the big issue was how Tanya Miščević, from what I remember, was complaining about the PR aspect of this and how et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But let me try to rephrase this. So that question was a lot. So let me try to rephrase that question. How are concerning the image of Europe, are the European leaders selling the image of Europe well enough or not? Or are they failing somewhere? So that's, whoever wants to answer that can answer that if you want to. No, all right.
I'm not going to answer your question, but could I answer the first question?
Yeah.
From a person who's followed and worked in Europe for most of the last 40 years, I would answer to Serbs to look at those countries which preceded you down this path. Is there a single one of them that isn't better off for having taken that journey and completed that journey, whose people are not more prosperous, whose countries are not more stable, whose countries security hasn't been strengthened by that. The same is true, I think, for not only Serbia, but all of the countries of this region. The United States, ironically, has been one of the biggest supporters traditionally over decades of the EU integration process, because we see it as helping to create a more stable and prosperous European partner for us. And if you think about the stresses and strains that Serbia has with your neighbors in this region, with your own future and economics, I cannot but help but believe that joining the European Union will help strengthen you in every one of those areas. And that should be the case that everyone here in Serbia is taking to the Serbian people, that you want to live like the people in the European Union, you want to be a part of that process, but you are also seeking to join a club, and you've got to do the work to become like a member of that club, and in so doing, you'll make movement forward. And if I can say just because this will probably be my last time on the microphone, I did want to read one small excerpt, because there's a lot of talk about, Donald Trump doesn't like the European Union, Donald Trump doesn't like Europe, and so forth. Well, Donald Trump has one document which he has signed his name to, which is the National Security Strategy of the United States. And in that National Security Strategy, it talks about our relations with Europe in very clear terms. And he says, the U.S. is safer when Europe is prosperous and stable and can help defend our shared interests and ideals. The U.S. remains firmly committed to our European allies and partners. And we would like to count Serbia in among those European allies and partners and see it join the European Union and help to strengthen both Europe, but also U.S.-European relations. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
No, to respond to his question, the message is EU is the best opportunity in a generation for Serbia's future. This is what I believe. The reform that Serbia has to do to get there beneficial for the people is not reform that are in a vacuum. They are on the life of people, economy, prosperity, peace, democracy. You need to work hard to get there. It's not no shortcut, no distraction. And once you are part of the family, the job is not done. Paradoxically, it's just the beginning, because the world changed and the European Union has to adapt itself, and the members within the European Union have to share the same travel direction, and that's why where you're in, you have to keep working and bringing the same baggage as the others.
I think we're ending here, unless somebody really needs to ask a question. If so, please raise your hand now. No, well, thank you very much for being this late with us. I was hoping that at some point we'd move this panel into a different time frame, but we'll see about that next year. Let me please ask you to join me in thanking the ambassadors, our guests here, for this fruitful conversation.